go ahead and get started. My name is Stacy Eagle-Elk. I'm the program director for the Great Plains Tribal Opioid Response Program here in Rapid City. I want to thank SAMHSA for helping make this available. I also want to thank our Native Connections program, our HPOG program, and our Great Plains EPI program for collaborating and helping all this come together and make it happen for us. They've really provided a lot. And I want to thank Tiffany for being here today with us. Few housekeeping items. We are recording all sessions and they are posted on the Great Plains Tribal Opioid Response Illegal Drugs page. I'll put that link in the chat. Maddie, Haley, and Brooke will be monitoring the Facebook Live. So if you have questions and that's how you're monitoring or viewing the session today, just put your questions or comments in there and they'll share those with us. I want to say thank you also to all of you who have been with us through this series for being here today. And I want to welcome you to Adverse Childhood Experiences and the intersection of substance use in our community. Today, our presenter is Tiffany Petro. She serves as the Director of Advocacy and Prevention, overseeing the Children's Home Child Advocacy Center and multiple statewide awareness and education campaigns. In addition to overseeing collaborative investigations of child abuse cases, Tiffany provides forensic interviews for local, state, federal, and tribal jurisdictions and comprehensive trainings rooted in understanding trauma and recognizing and responding to child abuse. Tiffany believes that by empowering children, we can create resilient families and communities. Tiffany received her BS degree in psychology from Black Hills State University, her MS in public health from Capella University, Minnesota, and her MS in human services from Capella University, Minnesota. And I would like to welcome you, Tiffany, and say thank you again for joining us today and providing us with all of your wisdom and your knowledge. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, and warm welcome to those that are joining us via Facebook or joining us here on Zoom. And just a little note, if you saw the flyer and I was supposed to have a co-host, but she was blessed with the birth of a daughter. So we are, you get me. So thank you again for allowing me to share this space, and certainly want to honor all of the experts in the room in this space of understanding.
We'll send our congratulations to Heather on the birth of her new child.
Yes, I certainly will. She's at home with baby. So let's go ahead and get started. Really, as we unpack and explore today, I invite you to stay curious about how what happens in our formative years really can shape how our communities are coming together and the experiences of the adults or the relatives that you're working with. What we know is that from the first spark of life, as cells divide, forming that tiny beating heart and that fragile skeletal structure, the central nervous system, that relationship with that mother is created. All of those external experiences that mother moves through are passed through to their child. Understanding that before we can ever verbally recall or thoughtfully respond to our experiences, those messages, those lived experiences are being stored in a cellular level. If I asked you to type into the chat a song that takes you back to a high school dance, I would imagine that most of you could give me that information, or tell me about a smell that takes you back to grandma's kitchen. Those favorable memories that we don't always recall, but that are embedded in us. But just like with those positive experiences, we also can store anniversaries of losses or grief or negative memories. And it's important to understand that often, especially those that work with substance use disorder, individuals that are experiencing those things, we'll talk about triggers, right? That's a common word that we are often referring to these as. but these memories that and experiences that make us up who we are. We know that, before we talk about this interconnection, I want to talk about how the brain is formed in those formative years and how those lived experiences can start to shape our trajectory, right? So our body is designed to keep us safe. We are hardwired for connection and seek safety first and foremost. And so as we move through our physical environment, we take in that information. Is this hot? Is it cold? Will this chair hold me? Will it not? And we can understand what that looks like in terms of physical safety environments. But we also know that safety often refers to also psychological safety, emotional safety, right? And so just like we're taking in messages about whether or not this table is hot or not, we're also taking in information where we say, are you good for me? Do you have good intentions? I'm not so sure. Because we're hardwired for connection, we start to, at a very young age, start to look at, how do I survive in this environment? So we're born with all the brain cells that we're ever going to need. In fact, 85 to 90% of all brain development happens in that first 5 years of life. Think about how crucial those beginning moments are. So we're born with all the brain cells that we're ever going to need, but they're not hardwired or connected together, right? And what we know about children is that they're egocentric. You remember me talking about how we start to figure out, how do I survive in this environment? So if you have a baby who cries out and mom doesn't come, that baby's going to start to believe that there's something wrong with them because of that egocentricity. They don't know that mom is struggling with postpartum depression, for example. Or if they cry and mom only reacts when they're having a negative behavior, but that's the attention that they're craving, they'll start to hardwire where they're more prone to act out. You see, they're trying to survive in that environment. So by the time our brains hit elementary age, and this is at 6 to 12 years of age, our synaptic neuron connections are on fire. We are supposed to be excelling in STEM and science and math and relationships. But all too often, our environments are chaotic and stressful and unpredictable, which means I'm going to focus on that bottom part of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Which is, where does my next meal come from? Where does my next, how can I keep myself safe? How do I keep mom safe? How do I keep dad safe? And so we start to hardwire those synaptic neuron pathways that say, this is what's going to keep you safe. So by the time children hit puberty, and for the purpose of this research, they looked at the age of 14, a pruning process happens. It's a use it or lose it. So essentially, if I haven't hardwired a synaptic neuron connection that says, my words have power, or if I say no, people will listen to me. If I haven't hardwired that, that synaptic neuron can fade away. Essentially, that doesn't get hardwired because it hasn't been reinforced in my environment. Now, I wish that this slide had one more column that looked at the brain, the adult brain synaptic density. We know that the adult brain is not fully developed until we're 25, 27, depending on the individual. But I don't know about you, but I didn't magically get smarter when I turned 18. The opposite might have been true. And so I don't become a functioning adult just because I reached a numerical number. If I haven't formed those synaptic connections early on, I don't get those back. In fact, we can't hardwire something at 25 that we didn't have the connection for at 14. Now, here's the good news about the human brain is that it's plastic. We have something called neuroplasticity, which means I can't hardwire that synaptic neuron that I was missing when I was 5, but I can learn a new way to move through life. Unfortunately, and what we'll talk about later is that children who experience adverse or toxic stress environments, they don't get those coping skills necessary. And so they become adults who seek out unhealthy coping skills or mechanisms in order to try to figure out, how do I move through life? How do I create safety in this space? You know, each person is unique, but essentially, let's talk about the two very different worlds that people can walk through. This blue part on the bottom is the benevolent world. It is good and it is kind and it makes sense, and people feel like they have options and processes and possibility. Now, if you worked or lived or moved through a truly benevolent world, life might come pretty easily to you. But for those of us on this call today, I would imagine that we would agree that that's not the reality of life, nor is that productive. We're not calling for a world that is free of all adversities or all traumas. If you were with us last week, you would have learned that some stress is good, manageable stress where we have options and supports. We need those moments to actually build up resilience. More often, what we find, though, is that we're in that top section, which is the malevolent world, where things are chaotic, stressful, and challenging. Now, individuals with that lived experience can be quick to emotionally detach. They can be quick or impulsive to make decisions, and they are often labeled by society as being at risk, throwaways, runaways, right? They don't get those kind and considerate opinions or options for being the survivors that they are. What we're called to do here is look at, we need these two worlds to know about each other. Those that are seeking, those that have seemingly good and multitude of options, they need to know that life is hard so that they're prepared to deal with it. But rightfully so, that those that are living with toxic stress need to know that there's hope, that there are options, there are possibilities on the other side. This is probably one of my favorite slides to use because it really calls me to an action. When we set our expectations on how someone else should adapt to their story, we've already set them up to fail. When we try to separate the person from their lived experience and everything that has come before them, we are not being considerate that their brain may work in a different way. We eject or reject them from our society and say, oh, you don't fit in here, you're not following the rules, it's our way or the highway, essentially. That creates a negative feedback loop for individuals that keep them stuck in shame and secrecy and darkness. When we talk about why it's so hard for individuals to come forward, understanding that if my environment has essentially proven to me to be unsafe or unstable, it's this reinforcing loop of, well, guess I was right, right? Guess this is where we're at. And it feeds into this negative perspective that no one's there for them and no one's willing to give them an option. What happens if we instead start to ask a different question? Instead of, why do you keep doing this? Why did you make that decision? We actually start to ask, what happened to you? Help me understand your story. How did we get here? Understanding and respecting that those with lived experience are the least likely to trust. They're the least likely to come forward and seek help. It becomes difficult for them. It's harder to build that rapport. It's harder to seek that out. What we know about how the brain develops in any sort of environment is that there are going to be these sensitive periods that can be easily disrupted by adverse childhood experiences, by toxic stress. And the brain develops in a sequential fashion. So the first part of the brain that develops is that survival, that brain stem, that reptilian brain, whichever verbiage you choose. That's the foundation. And so when that's built on an unstable platform or a toxic stress environment, you get cracks in that foundation. That sets that child out on a path to struggle with self-regulation down to the very fundamentals of how their body work with temperature, sleep, their ability to connect with others. One of those systems that can get disrupted, because the next part of the brain that develops in that sequential fashion is the limbic system, the part of our brain that says, I'm good, I'm worthy, I'm valuable. This part of the brain controls everything from physical balance to your internal temperature and even your digestion. When we think about the ability to regulate, we see on the screen here that talks about our hormones, our mood, our heartbeat, our sexual behavior. The limbic system is vital for learning, memory, and reward reinforcement processes that help us stay on a healthy track, that help reinforce those healthy coping skills. When we are responding from a state of fight, flight, or freeze, essentially our body gets hijacked. That prefrontal cortex, that cortex part of our brain that doesn't fully develop until we're 25 or 27, think of it like a computer. It goes offline, and guess who's in control? This fear response. Your amygdala takes over, and it's looking for stress and danger around every corner. And that can make it hard for an individual, and especially a child, to learn how to cope and regulate. So the hippocampus and amygdala are two regions that are found in this limbic system, and they're vital for forming those healthy relationships. Remember how I said we're hardwired for connection. These are the centers for affect, our facial recognition, how we respond or engage with others, and attention. They help us make meaning of those social cues and language, and even help us remember our verbal and spatial information. Now, if these two parts of the brain are constantly dysregulated or activated because we're fearful of the environment that we're in, they might put us into a whole range of emotional responses, from panic to fear. This is going to result or look like a lot of disruption and emotional dysregulation for children. But remember how I said there's that one more column where adults don't magically become better adults just because they had an 18th birthday? These are children that essentially, these adults are children that essentially didn't learn how to regulate or cope or move through a world. They are great at surviving and figuring out where my next move is and where can I sleep tonight and where does my next meal come from. But interactions on a day-to-day, such as moving through a treatment program, filling out a bunch of paper in a system that wasn't designed for them, that can become quickly overwhelming and easily disrupt or derail any progress that they're trying to make. So when we think about those core or sensitive developmental periods, one of the other parts of the brain that can get disrupted is this cerebellum vermis. It connects the two halves of the cerebellum. The vermis is responsible for helping us move through our physical environment and enables us to perceive or receive that peripheral information, such as when you're walking down an alley and it's taking in information from like who's walking down the alley next to you. It helps us take in that information and even helps us perceive our safety. So it's no surprise that one consequence of maltreatment or a toxic stress environment is going to be attention problems, including attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. The vermis is also the part of the brain that regulates the release of our feel-good chemistry, the norepinephrine and the dopamine. Research on abuse on this region showed not only a reduced size of this vermis, but a decreased blood flow and functionality as well. That is going to limit us to positive feelings, right? Am I good? Am I worthy? Am I worthy of receiving this treatment? Am I worthy of asking and receiving this help? With limited access to these feelings, it's not surprising that this impact can lead to a vulnerability for depression, suffering from other mental health issues, or even a substance use disorder. It might cause some disruption and encourage or direct people down a path where they're more likely to choose a substance to manage their emotions versus seeking out and asking for that connection and help. But stress can be different for the individuals. Our stress response hardwires into us about that early 20s. What we know is that toxic stress in those early formative years of childhood has profound effects on brain structures and functions that don't or might not play out until later. We might not see the impacts of trauma or chaotic, stressful environments until much later. When we think about the human brain, we are only meant to handle toxic stress for 20 minutes at a time. At 21 minutes, you're getting too many stress hormones. Now, our stress hormones are good and useful, and they keep us alive. Say you're in the forest with a bear. You might have heard me use this analogy last week when we met. But what if you live with the bear? So I'm going to bring that example back. What if your everyday is just a constant wash of toxic or stressful hormones over your brain? It's actually going to hardwire you to have that lower window of tolerance. You might become more likely to be an agitated individual or a withdrawn individual. It completely disrupts how you handle even the simplest of stressors. And so you may be thinking of a relative or a loved one right now that doesn't do well with stressful environments. How much they can tolerate may have been hardwired into them at an early time frame. So epigenetics is a new scientific field about really how an experience can get under our skin. Our genes are contained in the DNA of our cells. They provide instructions for cells to become specialized into liver cells, heart cells, and so forth. We used to think about our DNA like a blueprint. Now we like to think of it more like a switchboard. Certain environments or genetic predispositions or certain genetic coding can cause our cells to be, or our DNA cells to be read in a different way. Epigenetics tells us about the way that instructions on our genes are used. And so a very high level viewpoint is essentially these histones can attach to your DNA and cause it to be read in a different way or to not open at all. Remember, like a switchboard. And that means certain events throughout life can cause those switches to move through different ways. But epigenetics answers a very important question, which is it nature or nurture? What's more important? My DNA that I was born with, or how and where I'm raised and the environment that I'm being fed information through? Epigenetics answered that question and said both. What we know through this research is that, and let me preface this with saying I am not a historical cultural expert, and I would never claim to be. That is not the space that I hold. But what I do know is that science has proven very clearly that historical trauma impacts the generations that come after. And although we can never undo the atrocities that have been placed upon and forced upon individuals, such as racism and boarding schools and the Holocaust, what we know is that we can do better for the next generation by acknowledging that it does impact us on a cellular level, and that we can pass adversities and fears that are reinforced through our environment, through our genetic coding. But just like we can pass adversities through our DNA and our cellular level, we can pass resilience. We can pass what we call protective factors through environmental reinforcement when we respond in a healthier way. And this means that as a community, we have to make a commitment that we're going to acknowledge the effects of our history and make a commitment to do better for the next generation. Because as long as we continue as a society to reinforce fear through racism or systemic oppression, it's harder to put those protective factors in place. So fundamentally, what we know is that ACEs are common and they're highly interrelated, but they have a cumulative impact that can be captured. We know that people with a higher adverse childhood experience score are more likely to have multiple health and social problems, some of which increase their odds of children having those same or higher ACE scores. I really appreciated the visual representation on this graph. Looking at, it's not just one thing. It's not just, oh, a parent made an unhealthy coping choice. We have to look at the social determinants of health. What we know about the impact of how a person copes or how they move through life or the choices that they make is it's not just about the decisions they make about how they're going to cope with their stresses and trauma. We know that the zip code that they live in or how safe they feel in their community can also impact their overall resilience. We know that their access to quality healthcare or healthcare in general can also impact their overall resilience ability. So when we look at things like individuals who live in poverty or intergenerational poverty, when we look at issues with racism and systemic racism and systems that are not designed often for the people that are using them or needing them, there are so many elements that we have to consider when we start to answer the question, how did we get here? So the ACEs study itself was done in the early 90s. It was actually started in the early 90s and completed mid to late 90s. We've been talking a lot about the effects of toxic stress on individuals, but I want to switch gears and talk about what this means for us as a community. This particular study was the largest epidemiology study of its kind. And the data it gave us, although not specific to each of us as an individual, started to paint a picture about what it could look like on a grand scale if we choose to do nothing or we choose not to respond. So this particular study was started by two principal co-founders, Dr. Anda, who I was trained by in 2018, as well as 25 other individuals across the state, and Vincent Felitti, who was with Kaiser Permanente. They were each running individual studies within their own agencies. Anda was looking at why depressed individuals who were suffering from depression were more likely to smoke, and Felitti was running a weight loss clinic. Now, one of his patients, Patty, had started to put back on weight after being very successful in his programming. And he actually stumbled onto something accidentally. When he brought her in to talk to her, he asked, how much did you weigh when you first had intercourse instead of how old were you? And she said 40 pounds. She said, I was 40 pounds, I was 9 years old when the molestation started. He went back to his other individuals who had dropped out or who had struggled to keep the weight off and found an overwhelming correlation between childhood sexual abuse and their weight gain. Felitti and Anda got together to create this study. And it's important to understand that although the demographics of this study are not representative of South Dakota, they also did not cherry pick a community. The demographics were 70% Caucasian, 70% higher educated, with individuals with high access to preventative health care through the World Health Maintenance Organization. These were not individuals that they assumed or thought or knew would have trauma or traumatic histories. And so what they found was pretty astonishing. Before the ACEs study itself, we knew that if you partook in health risks and behaviors, that you were going to be more prone for disease, disability, and early death. When the ACEs study was conducted with over 17,000 participants, they realized that those traumatic experiences during those formative years were actually changing the way that the brains were designed, were structured, and that was likely to increase the risk for unhealthy coping skills, leading to disease, disability, and early death. The original ACE study did not take into consideration historical trauma or intergenerational adversity. That did not come until much later. What we know now is that individuals are being born with trauma because of the families that they're being born into. And then, of course, we talked about how some of that can be reinforced through environmental stressors, whether in that family or as a community as a whole, right? And that must be what makes people more at risk, right? Well, there was something that they weren't taking into consideration, which is even if a person does everything right, even if they make all the healthy choices and they take a different path, they're still at risk for disease, disability, and early death when they don't have protective factors in place. Trauma changes us, and it changes us on a cellular level. And when we understand all of the things that can go into that, we can start to do better by those relatives that we're working with in our community. So I told you that the ACEs study was done with 17,000 individuals. And I welcome you to put in the chat if you're familiar with this study at all. I always like to do a little poll of the audience about how many might be familiar with this particular set of data. So the original questions were geared at, before the age of 18, did a parent, guardian, or caretaker? So it did not look at siblings. It did not look at other trusted adults. It looked at just those that were providing care within a home. Maybe some of you know your ACE score. Maybe some of you are doing work in this space, and thank you for those of you that are carrying this message. I want to hold space for the fact that your experience may not be represented on this screen. It was the 90s. They did the best they could, but they looked at the primary things that they felt impacted or were likely to impact childhood development. So it doesn't mean that it didn't matter or that you didn't experience it. It just means that they couldn't ask everything. Thank you to those of you that are putting that in the chat. I do like to see who's familiar. So a question on this survey would be, before the age of 18, did a parent, guardian, or caretaker struggle with substance use? And that would have included alcohol and drug use. Were your parents divorced? Did a parent, caregiver, or guardian struggle with mental illness? Now, the scoring process is, if you answer a yes to this question, it's a 1. If you answer no, it's a 0. The max score you could get is a 10, and the least you could get is a 0. It wasn't about how many times a child experienced this particular adversity. It was about how many different times or how many different types, of adversity they faced. So battered mothers, of course, we would not call that today, was witnessing domestic violence, but only of mothers and stepmothers. So again, in the 90s, they didn't take into consideration men who were victims or survivors of domestic violence. Criminal behavior would be, did someone go to prison or jail? Emotional, physical neglect. You didn't feel like you had enough to eat. You didn't have clean clothes to wear. You didn't feel like you had somebody who supported you. And then emotional, physical, or sexual abuse. The percentages that you see next to each adversity, those are from the original 17,000. If you're reflecting on your own experiences now, I want to honor that there are a lot of things your ACE score doesn't tell you. My ACE score is a 3, but it doesn't tell you about my resilience. It doesn't tell you about my perseverance. It doesn't tell you about my coping skills. All it is a reflective example of how my environment as a child may impact me as an adult. But it also tells me what I'm at risk for via my health and my mental well-being. So this is how the numbers broke down for the original 17,000. 33% said, nope, I don't answer yes to any of those. The skeptical part of me, if I'm being completely honest, just thinks that maybe we didn't ask the right questions or maybe they didn't feel comfortable, but It is important to have empowerment when you're working with this kind of study, right? 16% said they have 4 or more. So the average ACE score for a child in basic foster care in the state of South Dakota is 3 to 4. The average ACE score for individuals in residential or children in residential facilities is 6 to 7. We know those ACE scores for our children in those situations because that information is being collected by that particular or by those particular agencies. There was also a study conducted through the BRFIS, which is like a phone survey in 2017, and 49% of South Dakotans that, of course, it is limited, had a phone, answered the phone call, took the survey. 49% said, yep, I have at least one ACE. And I do love that you all are sharing resources in the chat box, so keep that up. What we know is that ACEs can have lasting effect on not just our health and our behaviors, but our overall life potential. The original ACE study looked at ACEs as a dose response. So it's like gas in the car. The more gas you have, the further you go. The more adversity you face, the more at risk you were of experiencing those health and social problems. Now, it doesn't mean that everyone that has a 10 is going to end up with serious consequences for their life. What it means is that the risk is there. There still has to be taken into consideration as that individual and what resilience factors they are. But it starts to paint a picture. So we're going to go through some graphs from the original study to look at what the data showed us. So understanding that, again, there's this idea of these adversities can be attributed to high ACE scores. So when we look at smoking and lung disease, early smoking initiation for this research looked at the age of 12. So if we were going to ask, why do 12-year-olds smoke? What would some of the reasons be? And I'll have you put in the chat. Why do 12-year-olds smoke? To look cool. Siblings smoked, curiosity, parents smoked to fit in. Absolutely. Stress, love that, to be a part of a group. So smoking is one of those things that we have spent probably billions of dollars to try to prevent. All sorts of campaigns, everything from it'll make your teeth yellow for those that, were, concerned about the way they look, to it'll blacken your lungs, to it'll cause death. So even though we know that smoking isn't a healthy option for us, why do kids smoke? And I'm smiling at Dominique's answer to the panelists, which is like dopamine. She's heard me speak before, and it's very smart. So ACEs can result in depression and anxiety. Nicotine, although a stimulant, can reduce the symptoms of depression and anxiety. So the benefits of nicotine in reducing these unpleasant emotions might help explain why knowledge of health risks due to smoking are not enough for some people to quit. And we can think about that in terms of individuals who struggle to quit drinking or quit using opioids or meth. When we give a stimulant to a brain that is in a constant state of chaos or a constant state of stress, it actually will help to slow that brain down. It also works as an easier way to self-cope in exchange for not having to reach out, ask for help, and process those feelings, right? It's easier just to take the edge off. So let's look at alcoholism and the risk of marrying an alcoholic. So what you'll find on these next few slides is they kind of look the same in the way that they're set up. So the percentage of individuals with the problem and looking at the ACE score in a stepwise fashion. So we can begin to anticipate why ACEs are related to certain behavioral and society conditions. When we look here, the risk of becoming an alcoholic increases 6-fold from an ACE score of 0 to a score of 6. And ACEs affect relationships with people with higher ACE scores. They're more likely to marry an alcoholic. So if we think about this, ACEs tend to be transmitted from one generation to the next. So again, answering that question for nature or nurture. So even though trauma is as individual as a thumbprint, no two people will experience a traumatic incident the same, or see it the same, or process it the same. We do know that the age of the child, the biological sex of the child, and the type of maltreatment will impact brain development in the same way. So looking at that idea of biological sex, on this slide about depression, we can start to see how some of those differences might play out. Depression is the leading cause of disability in developed countries. We can start to see the dose response and how it might differ for men and women. What we know is ACEs are held in the body, leading to mental, physical, behavioral health problems, even and especially into adulthood. Some of those problems are unintentionally handed to the next generation, right? Suffering from depression can be part of that intergenerational transmission of adverse childhood experiences. So women with an ACE score of 4 or more are 60% more likely to experience depression than men, who sit at about 39%. Here's some place that I like to point out societal impact on how this plays out. So in the 90s, we weren't really speaking about mental health, and there's still a lot of shame that comes around with that. So if you remember from that slide a few ways back, it looked at, of that 17,000, 17% reported having a parent, guardian, or caretaker experience or have a mental health concern. If we were to think about our community right now, we might see a percentage that is higher than that. But for men, it becomes difficult to self-report or even to be able to have the space to talk about feeling depressed or sad or concerned. They don't receive always the same benefit that women do when we talk about being sad or talking to our doctors about being depressed. There is a societal consequence for some males when they start to express their feelings. This can be limiting and shame-inducing for those individuals and make them more self-conscious or inhibit their ability to even want to come forward. And perhaps maybe some of you have experienced that as well. So this particular slide wasn't part of the ACE, wasn't part of the original ACEs Dex, but it was taken from Dr. Onda's study. When we think about this stepwise fashion about how individuals may end up on a path where they're choosing to utilize substances and may end up with a substance use disorder, we can see this correlation for those that have a percentage of a high ACE score and those that may have ever had a drug problem, those that struggled with addiction to drugs, or those that ever injected drugs. What we'll look at a slide, an oil slick slide in a little bit, is that 71% of all IV drug use can be attributed to those that have high ACE scores. At 4 or more, we're looking at, on an individual level, at 4 or more, we're close to 3.5% who have injected drugs. ACEs have a strong relation to adult addiction. There's just no denying it. Research shows that 5 or more ACEs are 7 to 10 times more likely than those with 0 to have issues or struggle with substance use. In fact, as the number of ACEs a male child experiences increase, so does his risk for injection drug use. And that's from Vincent Felidi's work. This relationship suggests that addiction may not strictly be the result of biology or chemistry. You know, if two people inject heroin, what makes one more likely than the other to become an addict? ACE researchers concluded that the compulsive user appears to be one who, not having other resolutions available, unconsciously might seek self-relief by using materials known to have a psychoactive benefit, accepting the long-term risk of IV drug use. Those that have unresolved or untreated childhood trauma may be more likely to be habitual opioid users. One contributing factor to the development of addiction may be a mental health status. Unsurprisingly, children who experience trauma are also more likely to develop or experiencing those mental health conditions. So this particular graph was taken from a study conducted in Wisconsin. Some states have chosen to do their own ACEs work. South Dakota is just starting to really collect ACEs data, but that's a question I get often, which is, are we researching this in our state with our individuals? Not yet, but I know some people who would be interested in that. So this particular study was conducted in Wisconsin, and they looked at the use of a prescribed opioid pain reliever in the past year based on their number of ACEs. So again, at 4 or more, they're at 26% have used an opioid pain reliever in the past year. Fundamentally, though, ACEs impact, or adverse childhood experiences, trauma, impacts a lot of different areas. Here's just a visual snapshot of all the spaces that can be impacted. Everything from anxiety to cardiovascular disease to asthma. What we know about stress, of course, is that it compromises the immune system. We know that individuals with high levels of trauma in their childhood are at an increased risk for autoimmune disorders. So if you think about the bear and living with the bear, part of your stress response is that your body will key up your inflammation ability to manage that. So let's say the bear bites you, your body wants to be prepared to manage and control that wound. Well, when your body's in a constant state of stress and hyper-responsivity, that can basically dysregulate your immune system and how you respond to illness and how you respond to pain. And your body just stores all of that information. So it's not just those, I want to say, typical or stereotypical responses when we look at the community as a whole. Even just down to our ability to breathe, right? Asthma, my ability to get up and go to work every day. We know that everything becomes a little bit more challenging. And this can play out in a lot of different ways, whether that's promiscuity, unintended pregnancy, maternal related issues in terms of the health and well-being of our children, to experiencing intimate partner violence. It's all been tracked back to our experiences. So this is what we call an oil slick slide. Although trauma doesn't explain everything, and I do think that it's important to talk about that there are going to be some individuals that choose to cope in a way that might not be best for them, who do not have a history of trauma. But essentially what this research found, and this data was really amazing in the sense of we just hadn't seen these numbers before, and we hadn't been able to extrapolate this data before this study. So these looks at the overall percentages of these particular health and social problems in our community. And what we know, because trauma is interrelated, we can start to see how these factors might play out for our communities. So essentially, this research showed that 54.3% of all marijuana use can be attributed to those that have experienced high ACEs, 40% of recent depression, 67% of suicides. The idea about how trauma is interrelated is that we don't have to fix all of these issues at once. We can start with who we are and what we have, where we're at right now. Here's another look. 24% of cancer can be attributed to high ACE scores. 17% of asthma, 31% of those that are currently smoking. The beautiful thing about this is if you were to take a paper towel and put it right in the middle of this oil slick, it's going to soak up a little bit from each category. When we understand that ACEs are common and have a strong cumulative impact on the risk of health and social problems that we would like to see addressed in our communities and for those that we love and care about, it becomes very important that we talk about how do we prevent ACEs and their intergenerational transmission. So if that paper towel is soaking up a little bit from each section, it may not seem like 24% of cancer to 23% of cancer is a lot, but imagine 1% of all of these factors. What could that do for our community? Where I want to spend the rest of our time together. And again, I encourage you to ask any questions. Somebody will help let me know if there's any questions. Oh, I did see one from Kelsey before I move on. Are children of alcoholics more prone to marry alcoholics? I do believe so, in the sense that that has been reinforced through their environment and creates a space in which that almost becomes a new normal. And so that lived experience can increase the risk. Now, it's important to understand that we also look at the factors that sometimes that sends a child into a completely different direction, right? So if I experienced witnessing of domestic violence when I was growing up, I may be ever so committed to not experiencing that firsthand or not putting my children through that. But the risk is still there because I might not have that coping skill. I become more at risk for experiencing those adversities. So I do absolutely believe, and what I've seen through my work and research, or the research of reading other people's research rather, is that there definitely is a correlation. So I'm just reading some of these comments, I apologize. So lots of good conversation about epigenetics and how the myelination process works in creating that help of, or that support of healthy brain growth. So I have a question here. I've noticed Caucasian people who are descendants of homesteaders in South Dakota appear to have their own trauma is passed down. So Brooke, did you want to answer that one? It said that you wanted to answer it live.
Oh, sorry, I was just moving it out of the question section.
Great. Well, yes, I'll take a stab at it. So what I look at Caucasian individuals who have maybe an intergenerational adversity, again, I think that there's a sense of lived experience. I don't know that I would call it historical trauma. I tend to reserve that that space for communities of color. But I would look at the research on the potato famine in Ireland. So that study looked at how during the potato famine, mothers that were pregnant, their fetuses, essentially the babies, essentially learned how to live on fewer calories. Now, when they were born and the potato famine was over, or when that moved out of that space, there was actually a correlation between of having obesity. Essentially, their bodies adjusted to having fewer calories, and when food was readily available, they overate, and that caused their body to store extra fat. So when we think about this idea of things that can be passed down to generation, obviously being Caucasian, women have all the egg cells that they're ever going to have, right? And so when my grandma was pregnant with my mom, I was in there somewhere. So all of the adversities that my grandma faced from poverty and other types of trauma in her environment are being passed down to me. So regardless of cultural background, there are adversities that can be passed, regardless of if you're from a community of color or if you're Caucasian. So I wouldn't want to speak specifically to descendants of homesteaders, but I do think as a human being that we tend to survive in the environment that we're given. So any sort of environmental space is going to pass down to the next generation. So I had a question: how do we transfer biological knowledge to tribal leaders in culturally diverse perspectives, especially when each members are actively experiencing various aspects of intergenerational traumas? That is a great question. Transferring of that biological knowledge is essentially helping, yes, I'll send copies of the PowerPoint, is essentially, I wish I had an easy answer to that question. When we think about understanding epigenetics or the biological nature of it, it becomes really important about how we package that information, right? And I say that because with adverse childhood experiences and with things like historical or intergenerational adversity, the space is not here to call out your parents, right? I'm going to assume good intent that my mother and my grandmother did the very best that they could with the skills that they had. And so this idea of, if I'm going to start a conversation about how biologically, right, I'm passing down, I can't control what my DNA passes down, but I control the environment in terms of putting protective factors into place. And so what I've found is that when I can package that information from a space of, I'm not here to call anybody out or to say that they did anything wrong, but I hold space for the acknowledgement of it and look to, how do we change this for the next generation? How do we help them put protective factors in place? A lot of the feedback that I've been getting from individuals working within tribal communities has been, we want to focus on resilience, right? We want to hold space for our experiences, but we really want to say, like, what do we do about it? And each of those is going to be unique to that specific environment in terms of the champions in that community and what that looks like. But there isn't, I think where we start is just having a conversation, because epigenetics, historical trauma, there isn't, in that context of what it does to us on a biological level, isn't a commonly talked about thing. And so I think that where that all starts is just having a conversation about what this looks like and what we know to be true from the research. Yeah, that we're not bringing shame, absolutely. So biological knowledge, if each of us is different. And so that is a great question. How do we transfer biological knowledge if each of us is different? So when I speak to biological knowledge, we're speaking to this sense of, what science has shown us as being passed down to from generation to generation. And so that's where I like to use that analogy of a switchboard, because I think that holds space for us, that we're all individual, and that how it plays out for us on an individual level or a genetic level, we might not know specifically, but we can look at general references and we can start to normalize this idea of, yes, what my mother chose to do definitely impacted me, but I can also make a different choice. And so we don't have to boil out the water and get down to the individual themselves to talk about genetic coding or biological inferences. We can just talk about, what you experienced matters, what grandma experienced matters, and here's how it might have impacted our specific family. So we can start to look at those in different spaces. I hope that that answers your questions. You guys are asking great questions. Thank you for challenging my brain today. So when we think about the overall impact, if we're going to talk about resilience, and like I said, where I'd like to spend however long or however many hours, how many ever minutes we spend the rest of the time today, is talking about the now what. If we know all of these things, if we know about, that's a great response. If we know about how the brain impacts our overall development, then we can start to look at where we can put those resilient factors into place. So you remember me talking about the dose response, like gas in the car. The more gas you have, the further you go. I like to think about resilience as speed bumps. So those protective factors slow the gas in the car, right? And so what we know fundamentally and collectively is that the impact of childhood trauma is going to craft a very different adult. Their readiness to learn, their potential language delays, sleep disorders, eating disorders, their emotional dysregulation. I think that shows up quite a bit more that we see in our work. Attachment problems, difficulty forming relationships, mental health, negative self-image, suicidality, social withdrawal, poor impulse control, and of course our brain development. So when we look at this particular graphic, I think we can start to see the whole child effect. And then these children become adults who are part of our communities. And it's no wonder that we're looking at the social problems and health problems that we are as adults. Sorry, I lost my notes. But we would be doing a great disservice if we didn't acknowledge that this is tough work. When you're talking about how do we talk to tribal elders, how do we talk about biological trauma to other individuals when they're moving through that space, we have to hold space for the fact that this is hard. Sometimes I get asked, like, why isn't everybody talking about this? Why haven't we trained all 800,000 people in ACEs instead of just 15,000? Because if I'm going to talk about trauma, then I also have to talk about my trauma. And I have to hang a mirror for what this looks like for me. And when we think about something like historical trauma or intergenerational adversity, there can be a lot of shame that comes with that, or even a lot of defense and anger of, well, it wasn't me and I didn't do it. Well, it doesn't mean that it didn't happen. And it doesn't mean that we don't honor it. And the space that we're trying to get to with creating a common knowledge and understanding is how much hope and healing can come out of saying, I acknowledge that you experienced that and that it mattered. And that it doesn't have to do with anything else of feeling any sort of responsibility in that space. But it is important that we talk about that there are some tough things that create barriers for individuals to have these conversations. You might be working with individuals who are living this right now. So this is programming is like parent to or adult to professional. So any adult, even those that are currently walking through adversity, understanding that I'm not broken, that there's something I can do about it. I can make different choices. That feeling of hope can be really empowering. But we also have to get to a place where we're willing to have those conversations with people. We have to understand that there are those sensitive development periods. That means that there are periods where we need to be working with and focusing on in our communities as targeting our youth, right? That ACEs accumulate, that they're common and they're interrelated. This idea of poly-victimization means that things just don't happen in a bubble, that there are multiple ways that people can experience trauma or experience adversities, that there comes a cost to it. I sometimes joke about, I equate trauma-informed or resilience-informed work to eating organic. It's expensive and it's not available to everyone at the same level. And that this work takes commitment. And it's also kind of exhausting, right? To be present and self-aware and to continue to do this work even when doors are closed in your face. So I hold up for those of you that are working through this space, and even when you're tired, you still show up and do this work. But ultimately, what you do in your community, I can't tell you what that looks like. I wish that we had a recipe card for how we do this, but it comes down to those of us that are willing to be champions, that are willing to continue to have conversations. I'm not a lot of fun at dinner parties because I'm going to talk about trauma. I'm going to talk about resilience. But what works in Sioux Falls does not work in Rapid, does not work in Pine Ridge, does not work in Lemon. It has to be unique to the individuals that live there, which is why we want people to have these conversations and be the champions of this work. So I did have a question. So thank you, Dr. Stephanie. Any research that is inclusive of not only biological sciences and understanding intergenerational trauma, as well as metaphysical energies, natural energies from rocks. So let me think on that one, Dr. Stephanie. I don't have your last name here, and see if I can't, Stephanie Bickrow, and I will think about the best resources. I don't off the top of my head, but that doesn't mean that I don't somewhere in the back of my mind. Thank you for asking that question. The reality is that the ACE study provides us with straightforward information about the consequences of toxic stress during childhood. This particular set of research data gives us powerful information that we can use every day to improve health, safety, prosperity, and longevity. But it's not a detailed roadmap for services or programs, right? It's just starting the conversation. Oh, perfect. Thank you, Dr. Bickrow. Appreciate that. This news is simply too important to wait for someone else to design a detailed roadmap. Through our collective knowledge and action, we are the ones that have the power to shift the dynamics with our own families, communities, and society that lead to high ACE scores. So here's my call to action. When people hear this particular research, they often ask about resilience. What can I do now? They get excited about the notion of resilience because it reminds us that our support actions matter. Our desire for resilience leads naturally to figure out ways to put this into place for help for families and communities. And although we don't have a recipe card, we do know what research tells us about resilience. I do want to talk about a story that Dr. Anda shared with us during our training. He was a preventionist at heart. He was working at CDC at the time. And he talked about, he was the first one to receive this ACEs data. And he said, I sat in my office and I wept. So he goes back to, the same people that are directing us now and says, we figured it out. We know how to prevent trauma. We know how to reduce the intergenerational transmission of ACEs. And they said, great, can we write a prescription for it? No, it's not a pill, it's a process. We got to look at people's behavior and engagement and all of these things. And they said, how about a program? Can you map out a program that we can do from one end of the nation to the next? No, that's not how trauma works, right? We have to find our champions. We have to find our individuals who are passionate about this. The CDC sat on this information for a number of years. And it wasn't until Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, who was a pediatrician who had a had a clinic in Hunters Bay Point around the San Francisco area, got wind of this information. She did a TED Talk. It's 12 minutes. It's fantastic. And she made it aware that this research was out there, this holistic space of how do we treat this whole person? How do we create change? Interestingly enough, for those of you that might be in the medical space, not a lot of medical providers know about ACEs or really understand the intersection of adversity and the health and well-being. So if you're in that space or you're close to that space, then I appreciate that you're on this training or that you're doing this work. So back to these 3 protective systems. This is the closest to a roadmap we can offer. These systems interact and guide positive adaptation. They're powerful systems about the individual capabilities, caring and competent people, and protective community, faith, and cultural processes. What we do know about individuals, what we know is that for individuals who do well despite adversity, that they have these 3 protective factors nested together, right? It takes all 3 of these. We can help one another to develop those personal attributes that help us all weather life storms. And personal attributes are like a positive view of one's life. So when we talk about building up the individual, we tend to live in a society that is one of comparison, is one of fear of missing out, right? We don't live in a space where we talk about strength-based approach, that we talk about what you're good at. We tend to live in a space where people pretend to be popular and perfect on social media, causing anxiety and fear and shame even for individuals, when we really believe that must be how their life is, right? We only put the best of us out on social media. But we also are surrounded with people who say things like, yeah, that was great, but yeah, and also it tends to steal the joy and the wind out of our sails. So we have to build up that person by talking about, what are you good at? If I asked you to make a list right now of 5 things you're awesome at, how many of you could give me 5? On the same scope, if I asked you to give me 5 New Year's resolutions or 5 things you'd like to work on, I bet that list of things to work on would be a lot easier to talk about. The second part of building up the individual is looking at self-efficacy. Those that work in human services or working with humans in general probably didn't go into this job to make millions. If you figured out how to make millions, let me know. But we went into this work or we do whatever it is that we're passionate about because we're passionate about it. We want to make a difference. We want to matter. We want to know that we contribute to the world around us. This is why it's so important for kids to have rules and expectations, to be contributors to their community, their schoolrooms, their homes. We have to give people a place where they can plug in. The last part of building up the individual is self-regulation. So we didn't come out of the womb knowing how to do downward dog or boxed breaths. And a lot of our children were not taught coping skills. They may have been taught to survive and to sit there and be quiet or to not question adults. But not all children were raised in a respective environment where they were seen and honored and treasured. That can make it difficult for them to be self-regulatory, even in a calm environment. So what we know about those survival skills and how those are hardwired into our biology is that if I'm a kid who learned that a kick in the shin is what's going to keep me safe, even if you put me in a safe group or a safe classroom, kick in the shin is what I'm going to go to when I'm activated. Whatever it is that we're hardwired, we'll go back to those naturally, right? And so when I think about self-regulation as an adult, as a professional, and I use that term loosely for myself, this idea of what do I know, right? What do I know when I'm stressed out? What am I supposed to do? I'm supposed to drink water. I'm supposed to eat healthy. I'm supposed to sleep well. What do I actually do when I'm stressed out? I watch Netflix, I go on my phone, I eat Doritos, whatever it is, right? Hot Cheetos, Mountain Dew, Pepsi, right? I go to all my junk food options. I do the exact opposite of what I know my teaching tells me to do, because hardwired eating kept me safe, right? Eating was my emotional eating is my hardwired synaptic neuron. So self-regulation takes practice. It takes us being purposeful. So I would like to have you jump in the chat if you're so willing to do so. Tell me about what are your go-to self-coping skills? How do you regulate? Is it a special list, playlist of music? Is it reading? Is it meditating? Is it ceremonies? What is it for you? Go ahead and share out if you would. I love that you're all so responsive in the chat. Thank you for that. Environment, yep. Self-reflection, love that. Reward with food, okay. Reading, what else? How else do you self-regulate? Do you do exercise or long walks? Music support meetings, relax in nature, meditation, gardening. I know I'm just starting my garden. I'm very excited. Physical activity. You all have fantastic coping skills. I need to hang out with you guys more often because I might be with me and the one that's using food, me and her, like this. Write down lists, research, love that. Spending time with kids. What they say about that is professionals especially, keep that list close by, whether it's in your cell phone or a sticky note on your desk. When we get activated, when life gets too hard, when we get disappointed because a client made a choice, maybe an unhealthy choice, we revert back to maybe some unhealthy coping skills, or perhaps guard ourselves off. I'm looking at Dominique's question. The healing is the acknowledgement of connection. Absolutely. I know that I'm less likely to connect when I'm overwhelmed or I'm stressed. Thank you for doing that with me. So here I want to highlight how important you all are. The second protective system we can, and this is back to Dominique's statement that she shared, is that we can nurture in belonging. There was a rat study done in which they looked at the impact of on a litter of pups who had adversity, but essentially didn't have a caring or nurturing mother, and how detrimental that was. They had poor coping skills, they had poor problem-solving skills in comparison to the pups that had nurturing, supportive mothers. But what was interesting is that they conducted a second study in which they switched them, and they switched the rats with mothers that weren't theirs. The rats that had nurturing, regardless if it was their biological mother or another mother, fared better in research or in the trials and the ability to finish the maze and things like that than those rats that had no nurturing. How important is that to have that connection? Right, we all talk about the importance of having people in our lives, people who recognize and encourage our unique talents, interests, and strengths. But the defining factor here is having caring and competent adults. Those are what are vital to contributors to resilience and recovery. I'm sure we can all think of a relative or a loved one who cared for us, but may not have been the best for us or always encouraged us to do our best. And we know that kids are fiercely loyal and they will stay committed to those parents or caregivers, even when adversity is present. Sometimes this message about caring adults can get shortened, but we know that competency requires learning new skills and practicing safety in all of its forms when relating to people who are hardwired for survival in a dangerous and unpredictable world. People who have difficulty with emotional regulations, picking up on social cues, can be challenging friends and neighbors to have. Their behavior and their actions can make it difficult for people to want to connect with them. Relationships that provide security and belonging, right? How important is it that we belong? Relationships that can provide that will become a norm as we can learn and improve skills and competencies, but not also that, but give us hope that somebody's in our corner and somebody has our back. The last element that we talk about is community, faith, and cultural processes. Now, it lists faith here, but I am not defining that. That is not for me to define. For some people, faith may be a church home. It may be meditation. It may be an agape, holistic type approach. It may be a walk in the hills. If we've decided to dramatically improve health and safety for this and future generations, we have to foster those thriving communities. And that is about empowerment. It's about investing in people who have the most at stake so they can be the expert leaders on their own and in their own community. You know, as we invest in this idea of community capacity, we can start educating others about the neurobiology, ACEs, and resilience so that local people have a common language for cross-sector and multidisciplinary work. But building capacity is about belonging and finding people who hold us up and create a better space for us. ACEs is not about not holding people accountable for their choices. Children and adults alike need boundaries, rules, regulations. They need consequences. But as humans, we want to find people who are like us, who have similar experiences. And so that means I'm either going to find people who hold me up and make me better and are consistent and caring, competent adults who share a space. Or if I'm rejected and ejected from that society, I'm going to find people who validate my unhealthy coping skills, and I'm going to stay in that space because at least they don't shame me. When communities engage in the capacity building, they dig deep into the human experience that have shaped their past and influenced their present. From generation to generation, people pass their history of experience, including rich heritage, language, and traditions, and it's also the experience of those negative things like historic trauma, slavery, racism, or injustices. Like I've already said, the ACE study did not measure historic trauma like slavery or children being taken from their parents or forced to deny their culture and language in boarding schools. Neurobiology would suggest that these and other traumatic experiences that elevate stress hormones for long periods of time that during child development would have long-lasting, enduring effects. But for every trauma history, there is also a survival history, a history of resilience, cultural continuity, including reclaiming cultural ways after a time of loss, is a powerful driver of well-being. One of the quotes that we love is with Drs. Bonnie and Eduardo Duran that says, one of the first things that has to be done is to ask the community what is important to the community. And that communities are going to be the ones that know their answers to their own problems. And really that the change will come from within. There was a study up in Canada, Canada's First Nations, about cultural continuity. And they found that self-government, land claims, education, health services, cultural facilities and having tribally controlled police and fire were significantly reduced the relative risk of suicide among youth. The right to self-govern reduced relative risk of youth suicide by 85%, while cultural continuity in education reduced relative risk by 52%. So as we move forward, and you may find yourself thinking, now what? Where do I look to? Like, what's the next step? We know that, like so many other paths, that we have to look at a holistic approach. That to be a resilient, informed community, we have to look at all of the pieces to the puzzles. That the resilience can help, the ability to bounce back, to create trauma-informed care facilities, agencies, workplaces, right? And that healing does take a village. Together, we're working to disrupt the cycle. Dr. Big Crow, that was actually, I'm going to go back to the slide so I have my notes on that particular study. The Effects of Cultural Continuity in Canada's First Nations by Michael Chandler and Christopher Lalonde is where I pulled those statistics from. You bet. So the principles of trauma-informed systems of care may not be the only principle that matter for the changes we seek, but they are important because we are working to ensure that people most affected by ACEs will have the safe space to provide the leadership. This shows some of the principles of trauma-informed systems of care. So safety, right? So physical, emotional, and psychological safety. We often talk about this connection and how connection in itself can help individuals feel safe. Trustworthiness. Are you trustworthy to hold a space for everyone to contribute to solutions? Are you willing to let other voices be at the table? Are you willing to have others be the experts for themselves? People who have had a lot of adversity in their lives have experienced times where they don't have choice or control over their own safety, even over the important parts of the journey of their lives. We want to build in choices and options into whatever work that we do so that we can engage and really be listening and hold space for them. That space is really about this collaboration. You know, as we talk through this research, it's this collaboration between science and the public and these new findings, and how do we make this culturally competent and sensitive information? How do we make it matter to the individuals that need to hear it the most? For communities that have shown great response to building healing communities, they have found success in ensuring that people feel like they're heard and they're seen, that they know that their ideas are worthy of action, and that their ability to contribute creates that positive change in our community. We're tempted to move in with a fix. We're tempted to move in with solutions and answers. But there is a danger in trying to solve too fast. We hold the safe space for challenging feelings that come from realizing that we are all participating in norms that not only produce ACEs and ACEs effects. So when we can create the space of that trauma-informed care, we can start to break some of those norms that are attributing to the intergenerational transmission of ACEs. To create that lasting change, and those of you that are working in the space of substance use disorder, that you know that change does not come easily, and you know that relapse is often part of the healing process. You heard me ask a different question earlier in our time together, which is, instead of asking why are you doing that, to what happened? How did we get here? I personally like to think about things like behaviors as symptoms of trauma. That there's always something more to what's driving the behaviors. And if we're going to create systematic change, if we're going to create programming, then we have to stay curious about what's below the waterline. So this one talks about it in a sense of inviting transformation, perhaps in an agency or a programming. But fundamentally, people are just icebergs too. Me being tired or me being cranky probably isn't the why behind my behavior. So when we are willing to stay curious and lean into those situations, we can start to create positive feedback loops that allow for positive change. Supporting healthy community processes that respect cultural tradition and values is a high leverage activity. Just as rising tides lift all boats, a high capacity community lifts all people. People living in high capacity communities are less likely to experience high adverse childhood experiences scores, less drug and alcohol misuse, less depression and serious and persistent mental illness, and fewer problems at school and work. There's a predictable pattern to transformative change. It begins with a discovery and communication, which leads people to clarify their values and their thinking. With new knowledge and new habits of thinking, people change the actions they take in the everyday life. The collective actions of people shape a new reality that is ratified, right, and verified and validated through organizational and policy change. When we talk about this system of how do we create change within communities, we tend to, as a society, start with a top-down approach. Those of us that might be at the top, right? I always blame peer. So peer at the top is influencing change down, but they don't know about the people who are living and surviving and thriving within these individual communities. And so what this work looks like, what this call to action looks like, is listening to those that are impacted by ACEs, which is all of us, and letting their voices guide, like, what do you need this system to look like? What do you need this experience to be for you? And fundamentally, we know that both of those things have to meet in the middle to create true systemic change. But it's going to be up to us. We have to be willing to have the conversations and shape it with our thoughts and our words and our actions. Are we willing to do what we can with what we have right where we're at? This can be very overwhelming for individuals who are working in this space. It can be frustrating to have clients or relatives, whichever space you're working at, not be successful or not make the choices that you'd hope they would make. But just like ACEs isn't about not holding individuals accountable for their decisions or having consequences, it's also about extending grace for ourselves, which means we're not responsible for it. You can do everything right, but an individual still has that ability to make the decision that they're going to make. Part of this process is, how do you, as professionals in this space, stay resilient yourselves? How do you take care of yourselves so that you can be there for your client, your relative, or your client, or your guest tomorrow and the day after that? Looking at this space of, what is your story? What is the story of you? In all of this, I hope that you heard things that caused you to be self-reflective or understanding about maybe some issues in your own tissues that that work sometimes sneaks up on you, right? You get a particular relative that you're working with or guest that you're working with, and you're not necessarily prepared for all the feelings and emotions that you might experience through that work. So how are you going to take this information and change the way that you look and see and experience the world around you? Maybe your answer will be that I'm just going to continue to do what I do every day. Or maybe this is a call to action for you to create a space to take better care of yourself. So in the chat where I'd like to spend some time or finish up today, I always tend to be a little early in my time frame because I talk fast. What are the ways that we are lifting this burden from our children who know and are living in our community? And what next steps do you want to take? So I'm going to hold space and be silent while you're typing, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. I want to hold you up for the work that you're doing. I saw some programming information shared where you are doing some wonderful things with youth, but do some shout outs. What are you already lifting the burdens on for our children in our community? And or what steps do you want to take next? What are you doing already that is lifting the burden from our children? And what do you want to do next? I know it takes a while to type. So even if your space is committing to raise your children in a different environment that you were raised, absolutely. Working within tribal schools to keep interventions with families and children at the forefront, looking at community programming within their own tribal community to work on issues, partnering with other community agencies, love that. Thank you, Dr. Big Crow. Educating non-Indigenous peoples of the biological aftermath of historical trauma and the impact of physical health and spiritual fate of our nations. Legal protections and ownership. Perfect. Thank you. That was beautifully said. So for those of you that might not be working with children and are working with adults, I would challenge you to think about it in this space. How can I use this information to help the adults that I work with heal? How does me understanding how these things are connected help me be a better advocate for them? I think about the space of when I understand how we got here, I can extend a little more grace, or maybe I can be a little bit more mindful about how they learn, and maybe the things that I'm asking them to do, they might not have the skill set for, right? So I think about that when we talk about competence and this space of, am I giving them a form that maybe they don't understand? It wasn't written for them. Do they need to be more repetitious? Do we need to learn in a different way? So that's what comes to mind when I'm working with adults versus when I'm working with children. So some thoughts about how epigenetic might play a role in glutamate increase in those that have thoughts of suicide or who've died by suicide. People who have died have 7 times the amount of glutamate for those who die of natural causes. So for those that are working with the individuals who are suicidal or have suicidal thoughts, acknowledging gifts and nourishing their gifts, love that. Teaching language and cultural, letting them cry, letting them have feelings, I love I want to extend the utmost gratitude for allowing this to share this space together, and for all of you, I know each of you being experts within your own space, allowing me to share the information that I have. Teaching humanness. And I would encourage you to reach out to me if you have any questions. Like I said, I certainly, if I don't know, and I don't know a lot, that I will get you connected to people who do know. Please do your survey. But I will stay on and answer questions. I would welcome any questions or challenging thoughts or reflective feedback. So thank you. That's what I have.
Thank you, Tiffany. That was a fabulous presentation. And it all just comes together, you know, whenever we talk about this. I think it's really important that we start not being afraid to say it, you know, and let people know that it's okay to voice what has happened to them. It doesn't define them, you know, and we can move forward. Again, I just want to thank you for sharing your wisdom and your knowledge with us. Next week, and I want to tell everybody that next week, Dr. Cheryl Carey will talk about cutting as a cultural practice is the name of the session. We have so many of our youth in Indian country that are cutting, and so we're going to talk about that. Again, you can view our past sessions. I'll post this again in the chat. And each week we'll post the recording onto the website that we have here. Does anyone have any, do we want to carry on, or how do you want to handle that, Tiffany?
I'm not seeing any questions, but my email is on here. I know I recognize that other people might have other things to get to, but please do consider me a resource. I am here for whoever might need it, or like I said, to connect you to others. Virtual healing spaces. I have heard about some spaces that they're trying to move virtual, but I'm gonna stay curious and ask a question. Are you thinking about like practices, or if I know of any specific resources? Sometimes I need to take my own advice and stay curious. Seem to be very effective with our urban Native communities. Yeah, I haven't seen anything locally, Dr. Big Crow, but I would, I've heard about it more on a national level, so that we might be thinking of similar things, but it would be something for perhaps Great Plains to look at. I know I've heard of, I can never think of the word, so I apologize, but some talking circles have been held virtually, I believe, on some feedback loops. So, or feedback groups, excuse me. So I'll just volunteer Stacy and her team for that.
I'm sorry, what was that, Tiffany?
Dr. Big Crow was asking about a virtual healing spaces, and I was saying I was familiar with some like some feedback groups that were being held with our tribal communities or tribal elders virtually. And so I said, I think that Great Plains should look into virtual healing spaces.
Actually, we have one that's every Wednesday. I can get that information and get that posted onto our website.
Love that.
But we do have one that's, it may be more for substance abuse, but I think any safe space like that is, you know, a good place to start, you know, because why do we abuse substances? Because we have trauma, you know, that we're trying to kill, the feeling that we don't want to deal with.
Tosha, I love, see, you were all already on it. Love that you have more virtual spaces in the works. If anything, COVID has taught us that we can be successful with virtual telemental health.
Absolutely.
And that actually is more responsive for some individuals. It becomes easier for them to access. So love that. So. Yeah, so thank you all so much, and thank you for the opportunity. So
Thank you again, Tiffany, and I want to thank everybody for attending today, for your engagement and input into the chat area. And again, I invite you back next week for Dr. Cheryl Carey talking about the practice of cutting.
have a great week. Do something to take care of yourself, okay?
You too, Tiffany. Thank you so much.